I know people are confused about Okta Duo and the role of Microsoft. That we should probably talk about, but that's one confusion area we have to talk about. But what about conditional access as its own standalone function within Microsoft? Do people grok that and generally when they're interfacing with our security teams?
Mostly we don't see people doing conditional access without some kind of multi-factor because the benefit there is pretty low. Mostly because conditional access without multi-factor basically instantly gets invalidated as soon as you start hooking up people's mobile devices to get email. And no one really hardens that 100% anymore. Okay. So conditional access really has to work with multi-factor. Probably the biggest issue we're seeing with that right now is there's confusion that it's okay to say only some people have multi-factor. So we're actually hearing about that more and more, whether there's a belief that, well, this section of our user community isn't really an important target to bad guys, so we don't do multi-factor for them. Or everybody else has a E3 license of Office, but these guys really just use email, so they have an E1 license. So because they have a cheaper license, they don't really need the extra security. And unfortunately, when you're talking about something like spear phishing, whaling, normal phishing, or ACH wire transfer frauds, all of that, they prey on those lower level accounts. Because those accounts get a lot of email. They see a lot of things. Sometimes you're talking about the line worker and the task worker. What people don't realize is that's the exact person you want to monitor because they see all of the information. And the way the hijacks work, the first thing they do is lift the communication away from you so that you no longer see that someone is trying to subvert it. Because it's really easy for you to look at your email and say, wait, I never sent that. That's not cool enough anymore. You have to be more creative than that. So they lift the conversation away. And they can do it based solely on those really cheap accounts that people, quote unquote, don't worry about anymore. So from an MFA SSO, really the biggest issue we see is it's got to be universal and there cannot be exceptions. And so we see really those two bad things. There's a segment of the employee population that doesn't have it, or worse, there's a section of employees that are considered too important to be dragged down by multi-factor, and they end up being executives. We run into it where it's actually IT administrators themselves, executives, CFOs and controllers for sure, and they're flagged as rank has privileges. So by rank, I don't need to have multi-factor, and of course, they're the biggest targets there are. And what you open up yourself to there is not only are the really creative bad guys successful, but even the lame automated script kiddie purchasing bad guys are successful because you've basically taken the person with the most rights that needs the most protection and said, you get nothing.
What's really interesting, I think, for people listening is that sort of if you follow an 80, I call it the 80-20 principle, but that if they only did 20% of the security that we've talked about today, we've talked about a lot of different aspects, the MFA part of this and the conditional access and the multi-factor on this automatically scales the security of the organization tremendously because that endpoint that could have established geographical could be geographically just not in a region that you have an employee or that you have a contractor, and all of a sudden that person is accessing the network that Microsoft would have picked up that needle in the haystack with their AI tools in the back end. And I think it's really interesting to be able to leverage AI and build automation into your security environment is really important. And that it's not free, but it's a really important 20%er, I believe.
Mm-hmm. And what we can't rely on anymore is assuming that these attacks will show up as flagged from a foreign country. As a good example, we know, given the current situation with Corona, I don't know about you guys, but I get endless things from Google and Amazon and Microsoft saying, we'll give you some free cloud computing to move your stuff to the cloud. We'll give you free servers for 30 days. I mean, that's great for a bad guy because the bad guy gets to say, spin me up a server that's in New York City. It's free for 30 days. I can hack 200,000 people, shut that server down, and it'll just show up that it came from New York. And so when we talk about stuff like impossible travel and kind of the lower end AI that Microsoft does by default, I already know where the business is. I already know what the IPs are. All of that's basically public knowledge in a database that you can script and search. And so now I can just spin up a box in that locality. I'm almost guaranteed there's going to be a user near there. So, the fact of the IP looking quote unquote weird it is almost negligible because there's going to be someone else in that locality, right? You can assume almost any business here, if I spin up something in the Reston area AWS cloud, they're going to have an employee in Reston. So the fact that an employee in Reston logged in from Reston is not going to be at all weird. So we have to acknowledge that. That used to be harder because you used to have credit cards, and so then the bad guys would, of course, steal credit cards and use stolen credit cards for it. But now that there's a big push that says get out of your building because you can't go in anyway, that big push to throw things to the cloud really makes it very easy and, in a way, very automated for bad guys to be able to get this stuff set up.
So we covered multi-factor, conditional access, and we're saying that even though you're using a product like Okta, or you're using RSA, or you're using Duo, or some third party, that because of the value that third party brings, is that we've also seen mistakes on the Microsoft side, just making sure the fundamentals with the type of directory that you're using and how you're layering security into the core, even though we're depending on that third party. What licensing stack, you mentioned E3 and AD Premium, where are you seeing some of the fundamentals are being missed on the Microsoft side, even with the third parties?
So on the Microsoft side, the minimum you need is Azure AD Premium 1, because that's where the real version of conditional access comes to play. EMS E3 expands on that and includes it. So one of those two licensing is really what's required. However, another interesting piece is a good number of the folks who have fallen victim to the ACH wire transfer fraud actually already had either Okta or Duo. And so in their cases, we had one where they fell victim because they didn't secure Microsoft like we were talking about. But the other ones fell victim because they had either exceptions, exclusions, or the uncontrolled endpoints. So the uncontrolled endpoint got a malware. And so even with Okta and Duo, if that iPad is the CFO's iPad and it's his authorized device for home email or iPhone, whatever, if it's his authorized device, the fact that you have Okta or Duo does not really protect against someone tapping that device.